start off the questions on private hire. As a committee, we did look at this a few years ago. We put out a pretty damning report on TfL's role as a regulator, and we said they were, at the time, I think we said they were woefully inadequate. Obviously, things we hope will have changed and improved since then. But looking at private hire, my first question to you, or maybe Steve, you would like to start, is just what are the key challenges facing the private hire trade in London?
I think we're faced with some very unrealistic costs now that are a barrier to entry, that are stifling entrepreneurism and unprecedented bureaucracy. There's also a level of over-regulation. The private hire industry, I came along to Marsham Street before this building was here to discuss this with the carriage office and the assembly elect people. And we've worked very carefully for a long period of time to get private hire up to great standards. And all the compliance meetings we attend will point out to you that the industry itself is very, very compliant. Now, there's been a lessening of that compliance via the app-only companies who've come in and that don't have the checks and measures and the structures in place that the traditional companies have. So what seems to be happening is we seem to be getting regulation and cost thrust upon us that are as a consequence of these companies, when the actual bona fide industry, I mean, Rob's company's been here for over 50 years, Addison Lee, a similar amount of time, have been working perfectly well. And the regulation is causing a lot of cost and a lot of unnecessary angst on perfectly good companies that ironically are now getting put out of business because of cost and the amount of regulation they're needing to actually have to do.
What are your views about TfL's performance as a regulator of the private hire industry? Are they doing well? Are they doing better? Are there areas they need to really improve? Who'd like to go first? Steve?
Well, unfortunately, in recent years, it's not been improving. There's lots of policy being made without the dialogue that's essential with the industry. I mean, I came along to the Public Carriage Office in the 90s before regulation was in place to talk to the Public Carriage Office. That engagement seems to now being told what's going to be happening because a policy's been made. Now, the essential loop that's missing out of that, the English language test is a classic example of it, what we've ended up with.
We're going to get onto that in detail.
The point I'm sort of making is that if you don't engage with the industry about the requirements and then you introduce policy, you end up with a nightmare. You end up with challenges in the court. You end up with nobody really understanding what the necessities are.
So my first question will be, what are your views on TfL's proposal to toughen requirements for private hire drivers? Maybe I'll start with Steve.
Well, I was on the Sector Skills Council for 10 years, helping to get standards in for private hire drivers, and I've been very much of wanting standards. I mean, what standards need to be is fit for purpose. The standards need to be appropriate to the need of the customers, they need to be appropriate to the needs of the operators, and to the needs of the drivers. And I note in the Mayor's action plan, it did mention training for drivers. What training? There's been no training. It's absolutely essential that, you know, what's needed isn't necessarily regulatory controls and the big stick. It's actually training people. If you've been in the industry, like me, nearly 50 years, I don't need to be trained in certain things, but many people that are entering do need training.
Is there any evidence that the implementation of this test is forcing people out of the industry, people who can't pass, don't have the language skills, or just don't have the certificates? They may well be able to speak and write good English, but don't have certificates and can't bear the test. Is there any evidence that people are now leaving?
Yes, there is. And in fairness to the political support we've had cross-party support on the difficulties here, and we have had 2 meetings with the Mayor now. There are local authorities outside of London that have proven worldwide English-speaking tests and that assess their drivers with licensing officers. That's all you need to do. I asked a question at a compliance meeting the other week. How many compliance officers have found drivers out there that couldn't communicate in English? None was the answer. This is a massive, great big thing that's been put upon the industry.
I mean, are people working for you? Are they employed by you? Do they have or are they working by the job? And do you have a sense of how many hours someone is having to work in a week in order to take home a decent wage? Who wants to go first?
Go back to when my company, having worked for London Underground as an apprentice for 5 years, I clocked in. So I clocked in and out every single driver. Now, again, the technology enables us and the modern company to actually have a complete and utter record of not only drivers' earnings, but the amount of hours that they've done. And we work within safe bounds of hours driving, very much on hours driving, which was recently discussed with the Department for Transport, because there is a lot of rest periods for private hire drivers, because they'll stop and they'll park and they won't be driving. So the tiredness factor isn't the same as somebody that's constantly driving. All of that's very closely monitored, and again, technology enables you to do that.
Just at the figures, the latest figures we've got, there are 87,921 licensed private hire vehicles at the moment, and 113,645 licensed private hire drivers. So it's considerable numbers.
It's fake news, these numbers. I've raised this time and time again with TfL. The numbers of people licensed are significantly higher, but the numbers that are actually working, when you look at them, are not that much different from 10 years ago. Okay. You know, we keep getting told about an active driver. An active driver on the publicity in the media is a driver that's got a license. Many of them have left, many of them have gone abroad, many of them have died. There's all sorts of things, and they're still kept on as active drivers. Okay. When you look at the real numbers, it's near to 60, 70,000, which isn't far short of what there was when we started licensing process up. Yes, it's increased. I would suggest it's increased 10, 15%, but it hasn't increased by the regular numbers.
You and I had a lot of discussions actually around the new licensing fee structure. And I know there was some modification to it, but where do you stand on that now?
It's a catastrophe. It's bankrupting business. It's constraining business. It's only allowing big offshore companies into the sector now. And ultimately, it's going to damage not only the private hire trade, but the taxis. The fees are not fit for purpose. You can't tell me that a fee for a 100-car company that was £2,800 is now £500,000 is a sensible move. If TfL were short of money, they should have did what Addison Lee actually suggested and charged the company by the number of drivers they have on their books. Because the big app company is paying a pittance per driver, and the small good companies are paying a fortune. Now, we've got a member that operates in a tough part of town in the Streatham and Brixton area. Traditionally at Christmas, they move from 80 to 120 drivers. To have done that, if they'd increased to 101 drivers, it would have cost them £54,000. It's not fit for purpose. It's a tragedy, and we're going to go back to TfL and ask them to rethink on this.